Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
There you go.
I want to thank you all for being here this evening, and we are very excited about our program tonight and our program that is coming in the months ahead and weeks ahead. I want to give you an update on your academic World Quest winning team, which was from Central High School. They are about to board their planes to participate in the 2019 Academic World Quest competition in Washington, D.C. And thank you for your financial support. We wish them all the best. They'll be up against some pretty heavily armed teams from big cities all over the country, but we know they'll do great and they'll have a great experience. They'll be going to embassies, they'll be visiting the U.S. Institute for Peace, and they will be having receptions around town in addition to the competition. So thank you for that. Now, I want to remind you about a very special event that you may already have heard of in recognition of World Press Freedom Day. On Tuesday, April 30th, Tuesday at 6 p.m. at the State Theater, not here, Rami Khouri, Senior Fellow and Journalism Professor at the American University of Beirut, a syndicated columnist and a non-resident Senior Fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School. He's also a former Nieman Fellow at Harvard. Rami is an amazing character and has done a lot of work on the issue of press freedom and the protection of journalists around the world. But I think his most surprising honorific was that he was formerly the chief umpire of the Little League baseball league in Jordan. So maybe he can wake up our tigers. Rami Khouri's timely visit to Traverse City will highlight the importance of freedom of the press and focus on what the Committee to Protect Journalists describes as a profound global crisis of press freedom. So please join us. It's $5 tickets through the State Theater box office, free to all students, educators, and journalists. I also encourage you to mark your calendar for May 16th, our event here at Denos, when you will have a chance to meet Ambassador Charles Shapiro. And we were looking for an important topic, so we found one. He was the former U.S. Ambassador to Venezuela and the Director of U.S.-Cuban Affairs at the State Department.
Kind of important, yeah.
So he will have lots of interesting things to say. We try to get interesting speakers, and we certainly have one tonight. Our event tonight is sponsored by our friends at the Economic Club of Traverse City, and in addition to the much appreciated support from our seasoned underwriters, and that is first and foremost Boomerang Catapult and the FIM Group. And thanks to the Museum Center, Denos Museum, and of course our fantastic volunteers for the work they do to support us. Our very special guest tonight is the Chief Partner and Managing Director of WAY American Schools in China. He has worked for decades there and developing cooperative programs and exchanges in China, and also developing links between China and U.S. educational institutions. Many of you will know him as a former Michigan Superintendent of Schools here in our great state. But he's also demonstrating that he's obviously a prudent man when it comes to where he spends his winters. So he is president and CEO of the Economic Council of Palm Beach County, Florida. He'll be interviewed by our own wonderful Lowell Jep Grumman, a man with decades of experience in business and finance throughout Asia, and now the principal of our terrific seasoned underwriter, Boomerang Catapult. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jep Grumman and Tom WATKINS.
Thank you, Jack.
Well, I guess we should do a mic check first, Tom. But
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Right.
Can you hear me out there?
So, Tom, Michigan State Mental Health Director and State Superintendent of Schools. How did China happen to you?
I was really interested in China. I grew up in Washington, D.C., in three kind of major events. Maybe some of you can remember this, 1963 or so, and I'm digging in the backyard. My dad said, quit digging or you're going to let the Chinese in. You're going to dig all the way to China. The other is my mom, telling me to eat my peas. The children are starving in China. I said, here's an envelope, mail them to them. I didn't want to eat it. But the other one really is in fourth grade, and we're looking in a geography book or something, and the teacher said, these are red Chinese. And 10 years old, they didn't look red, they're yellow if anything. And then she said, they're communists. And I said, well, as a 10-year-old, what is a communist? And she said, they believe everybody's equal. But she said it with such disdain, like there was something wrong with that. And I said, well, what's wrong with that? And she said, but in America, everybody's equal. And I knew even then, at 10 years of age, that wealthy people were treated a little better than poor people, and white people were treated better than black people in Washington at that time. So it really sparked an interest, and that interest kind of grew. And any time I got a chance, and remember, during that time, China was like North Korea is today. It was kind of dark. There wasn't a whole lot that was going on. So to really understand, as a layperson, young boy, there really wasn't a lot of knowledge. And so I just kept at it. And in 1988, we were organizing a international mental health conference, and my colleague and friend, and the year before, a couple years before that, Governor Milliken, here, right, a hometown guy, had gone to China as a relationship, and I wanted to go, and so we organized an international mental health conference. A colleague said, can you invite the Chinese who were just coming back, the bourgeois, Western medicine of psychiatry and the like. So a lot of those people had been pushed down during those years. So we organized a conference. They came over, and my friend knew something then that I know now, is that the Chinese would feel they had to reciprocate. So in 1989, we were invited back. We didn't use any taxpayer money. We paid our own funds, but about 30 of us went to China. And it was about 30 years ago, almost coming up to this period. And it happened to coincide with the Tiananmen Square. And many of you remember Tiananmen Square on June 4th and what happened. But as I got off the plane and curious about what was there, the Chinese locals, I said, what about this event? They said, oh, it's nothing big. There's maybe 50 or 100,000 people gathered in the square. If you got 1.4 billion people, it's not a big deal. But I spent, during that time, we ended up traveling throughout the country and came back in Beijing, and I was hooked at that point.
That's fascinating. Your career track, though, started with juvenile justice and then carried through to politics, and then K-12 education and higher education came later in that process. And that's really where your experience in China has flowered and has kept you engaged since that time. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how that entree worked.
Well, the interest in it, my belief is that education, there's two things people can't take with you once you've earned them: your integrity and your education. So providing a high-quality education, building that connection, that human connection, is so important, whether it's local, state, national, or international. And so finding ways to do that. As an example, we were talking earlier, Xi Jinping, when he was the leader at a provincial level, stayed overnight in a farmer's house in Iowa. So that human connection really is important. So the Chinese were looking at ways to connect with us. They created, some of you may know, the Confucius Institutes that are out in America, where the history, language, and culture of China is embedded and taught in our schools so that people that can learn that. It's a way to build connections around culture, education, and the economic aspects of it. So what we're doing now is working with Chinese schools to connect them with U.S. schools, which helps both the Chinese, helps the United States, the students here. And we're also offering a U.S. high school diploma. Fantastic. For the children in China, so they can stay in China, earn the education. I believe that sitting in some university, maybe in this one, is a future leader of China. They're studying somewhere, probably in the United States or Great Britain today. And the way that we can build those human connections, those human interactions early on, I think is going to be beneficial to our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren.
Tom, you're also the managing director of what's called the Wei American School in China. What is the Wei School, and how is that different from other, say, international schools that operate there now?
Well, one of it, I didn't realize how bright we were when we put it together, because those of you who know in China, when they answer a phone, they answer it Wei, so it's a great brand. But Wei stands for Widening Advancement for Youth. We offer education here in Michigan and across the United States. We partner with local schools to bring project-based learning into the schools. Our curriculum is all on the web, so it's a web-based service. We bring Western highly qualified teachers to China to provide that education. WAI stands for Widening Advancement for Youth. We provide that high-quality education for the children in China. Our accreditation enables us to grant a U.S. high school diploma, which makes it easier for the Chinese students that wish to matriculate here. And if those of you don't know, in China, we have the MEP test in Michigan, or they call it something different, I think, now. But when I was there, it was dreaded. It was that single test given on a single day that impacted the child, the teacher, and the school. But in China, they have the Gaokao, which is a national test, and everybody takes it. And your stance in life, your chance in life, is determined on that test. I believe it's given over 2 days. And so a lot of the Chinese, and it's very much rote learning, memorization, and the like, as I like to say, solve off the top of your head, pull in the knowledge, and expect you to spit it out. So this enables the students to bypass the Chinese educational system, and our accreditation is accepted in 33 countries around the world, but America is really the beacon where most people want to come.
So if you wanted to go to one of the top universities in China, Tsinghua or Beida, University of Beijing, this would be something that you'd have to sit and get through, and that would be your entree into those universities.
Yeah, and again, one of the things that I reflect on, and we were talking about when I was in Tiananmen Square, one of the most profound experiences that happened in my life was when the Chinese students who would ask me, did I have an apartment? I said, I have a home. How big is it? I told them. How many families live there? I said, just one. Do you have a garden? I said, I've got a couple of acres. What do you grow? And I embarrassedly said, weeds. But after that, and if you can imagine a football huddle of 8 people deep, and I would say something in English and it would reverberate out in Chinese and then come back. But the most profound experience in that night, in the middle of May, with over 1 million Chinese students, is when the Chinese students asked me to describe democracy, to describe freedom. Now, I remember rambling on. You can have, I'm one of 7 children, and I was a small family in the Catholic neighborhood. Outside, there were bigger families there, but you could have one child or many child. You can believe in God, not believe in God. You could be an Episcopalian, a Methodist, a Catholic, a Jewish faith, a Muslim faith, and they all. But it was like describing, and I just felt so inadequate at the time, it's like describing what it's like to wake up in the morning and start to breathe, to be able to do that. And so the educational aspect where we can bring people together, where they can begin to see what really transpires here. It's not just something that's written in a book or something that they're told, but to actually experience it is critically important to me.
Thanks for that. As a prolific writer on public policy, particularly as it concerns China, there are a couple common themes in your work that I find very interesting, given the theme of our discussion tonight. One is that increasingly becoming more evident that the most important bilateral relationship that we have is with China today. And the second thing that I hear in virtually everything you're writing is, we have to stop whining about it and get on with it. How does that square with the fear that the rise of China is coming at the expense of our coming demise?
When I reflect on it, I was a boxer, junior Golden Gloves boxing champ, Washington, D.C., a few pounds ago, and football player for Boys Club. And my coach, when I would go to the sidelines and I'd whine about the other team, they were holding me, they were throwing dirt on me, whatever. In boxing, they was clinching, wouldn't let me get my punches in. I remember my coach giving me a good whack upside the head and says, I don't want to hear it. Get in there and find a way to win. And so what we need to do is not be about whining. Are there problems with China? Absolutely. We could roll them off the tongue, whether it's currency manipulation, theft of intellectual property, forcing the transfer of technology, human rights, which we may talk about tonight. So certainly there are problems. But rather than worrying about what the other team is doing, get your own team together. Get your own act together. When I look at China, they're investing in things that are going to make them strong, as you would expect, as they should. We need to do the same thing. And when I talk about that, I'm going to be very specific. Infrastructure. When you can get on a subway anywhere in China and pay less than a quarter to ride anywhere you want, bullet trains that are moving, airports that are modern, ports. I remember being in Beijing once, and my friend said, meet me at the train station. So I got up the next day, and I had written out in Chinese how to get to the cab and tell them to take me to the train station. And luckily, the cabbie, the taxi driver, spoke a bit of English, and he turned around and he looked at me and he said, which one? There's 4 major train stations in China. But beyond the physical things, which we talk about here, the governor fix the damn roads campaign that's going on now, and the water situation, which are some of the pipes and bridges and the like, that infrastructure. But the other are where they're investing is in workforce development, training and retraining of their workers, which we need to do more of. Most businesses can't find, even in this economy, can't find enough people to sustain their business. And the other is education. And when I was state superintendent, people would say, Tom, if you could bring back one thing from China, what would it be? Through their education system. And I said, that's easy. 4-2-1. 4 grandparents, 2 parents, 1 child. Imagine if we had 6 doting adults focused on the success of 1 child. So when I talk about, the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and the United States is being the most important in the world, I believe it is. Everything going forward, in my view, is going to intersect at the corner of Beijing, their capital, and Washington, D.C. Whether it's climate change, believe in it or not believe in it, the world economy, dealing with North Korea, dealing with the situation in the Middle East, it's going to intersect between our respective governments. So it's important that we find a way not just to whine and complain, but find ways to collaborate when it makes sense and compete and coordinate when that makes sense as well. If we don't, if we're just going to whine and we're just going to play defense, I don't think that bodes well for our future, our kids, and our grandchildren's future.
There may be a message there for us, indeed. I want to ask you a little bit more about your experience at Tiananmen Square, particularly as to who was in Tiananmen Square and who were you speaking with? Mm-hmm. It's a remarkable event nearly 30 years ago.
It'll be 30 years this June.
This June, right. And the fact that most of the people organized at Tiananmen Square, which lasted for days and days and days, were students. And that was a particular moment in history, a flowering of some sunbursts of lassitude and freedom for these young people. Tell us about the experience and how that squares with what's happened since.
Well, the time that I was there, and I was probably spent 3 or 4 nights in the middle of May, and June 3rd, June 4th is when the People's Liberation Army turned on the people of China, and depending on whose fact, hundreds or thousands of people were crushed or shot or both in Tiananmen Square, as they claimed it. We're fortunate that we even know about it. It happened to be the reason the international media was there is China was just beginning to make amends or work back with Russia. And so Gorbachev was in China for a major state dinner. And the Chinese were embarrassed because the gate to the compound where all the national leaders were at were blocked by the protesters in Tiananmen Square. And so the national media was there. If it would have happened a few weeks before, a few weeks after, we certainly wouldn't know as much, but people were reporting from there. During the period of time that I was there, it reminded me of kind of a Boy Scout jamboree. It was extremely well organized. It was young people. In fact, I'll never forget one night that I was there, they had headbands on with Chinese characters on it. And for those of you who grew up during the time that I did in the Vietnam War, I thought it said, you know, down with U.S. imperialism or something horrible, we hate the Americans. But I had a friend, one of the students gave me his headband one night that I was there, and I went home and I asked my friend to translate it. And what it said in Chinese characters was, "Mama, mama, don't worry about me." You know, it's kind of like at a football game, most of our kids are holding up, "Mom and Dad, send money." You know, you can do it. But it was very well organized, and the Chinese students were calling for things, as I mentioned before, with the democracy and freedom. It was the end of corruption, because China was beginning to open up, and as Deng Xiaoping, the leader that followed Mao Zedong, said, to get rich is glorious, and some of us will get rich first. And so some people were getting rich as they were transferring from a market economy or a communist socialist economy to a beginning phases of a capitalist and more market-based society. And there was an end of corruption and calling for this desire to be free and to be able to vote and to have more control over their lives. But it really was a lot of very young people. But it was almost like a supply chain with the older people and the workers that were making sure that water and food was coming in to feed, imagine, 1 million students in that square calling for greater freedom and democracy.
It must have been a fascinating experience to be there. You know, it reminds me of some assumptions that we all had early on in this process as China was opening up, that clearly that the economic relaxation of the rules and what you could do as an independent business person, the growth of business through the economy, and suddenly to be rich is glorious, and this is what we strive to do. Turned the philosophy of the communists on its head, but we all thought at that time that, gee whiz, we're relaxing rules around business and how we work economically. We thought that soon after that we would see some weakening of the restrictions and the constraints on how people live their lives and how political expression might be otherwise less constrained than it was. And it's turned out perhaps not to be the case. So how would you characterize what has actually happened given our expectations from that time?
Well, it was really interesting in that time because Deng Xiaoping followed Mao Zedong, and to me, the level of flexibility. I mean, imagine, those of you who recall those times, where the Great Leap Forward, which was a major disaster where they were melting down any tools, anything in the backyard furnace. It led to major famine. Millions of people died during that period. That was followed by a nation in psychosis with the Cultural Revolution, where things were just turned upside down. So people were coming out of 10, 15, 20 years of disasters. As we were talking earlier, can you imagine if China would have got its act together in 1949 and didn't have this convulsion of where they were going? But Deng Xiaoping, if you imagine a contemporary of Mao Zedong, and he was up 3 times and down 3 times. He was banished by Mao and brought back. Mao described him as a man of cotton and steel, soft on the outside and hard on the inside. But as he began to take over and open up, and again, the convulsion within China at the time was, how can you be communist and socialist and have free market economy? And I loved Deng's response. He said, I don't care if it's a white cat or it's a black cat, as long as the cat can catch the mice. You know, what didn't matter what system that it was gone. And he really didn't have, a lot of people say that they have the 5-year plan, but it's a 5-year plan with a lot of modifications, because there's the central government and then there's the hinterlands. As they say, the emperor is so powerful, but the emperor is so far, far away. And so sometimes when they set the things in Beijing, it takes a while to reverberate out. But Deng also said something that I thought was very important at the time, when he said that when they asked how he was going to go from communism, socialism, to kind of Chinese capitalism, he said, we'll cross the river by feeling for the stones, that we'll find a way as we go along. But you're right, at that time, there were expectation from the West in particular, is that if China opened up and became more prosperous economically, that greater economic freedom would follow, and that after that, you would see greater democracy and freedom that was there. And that has just not happened. It's a great American or great Western desire, dream, expectation. But China has its own system. And during the time, particularly during our meltdown in 2008, they would say to me, my friends, Tom, what system's better? Yours or ours? Your economy is falling apart, massive unemployment and the like, and their economic outgrowth was 10, 11% up until that time, almost for 20 plus years. And if we had 2 or 3% economic growth, happy days are here again. So it really hasn't panned out, and it really shouldn't surprise us, I think. China, 5,000-year history, has gone through major upheavals. The century of humiliation from 1849 in Shanghai, where the French and various governments would come in and take over Hong Kong, taken over by the British, forced treaties on them, Macau by the Portuguese. They persevere, and they tend to kind of write themselves back to the Chinese, the way of doing things.
A mere blip of 100 years in a history of 5,000.
It's not much.
In the Middle Kingdom. Let's take a quick step back a little bit, Tom, and talk about the notion and how we in the West tend to see China as a monolithic entity, when in fact it seems that it's anything but.
It really isn't. I mean, there's, first of all, very few people realize that there's 55 minority groups in China. And some of them, if you take a step back, you think about it, there's Mongolian people, Tibetan people, Uyghurs, which are Muslim Chinese, look more Turkish in terms, they don't look like a, quote, Chinese, but Miao, Suzhou people that are all over. It's a large country. It's about the same size as the United States, but about a third of the country is mountains and desert. So the space is certainly more important. But as I said before, the power to be in Beijing, the emperor is so strong, but they're so far away. There's different languages, and a lot of people don't realize, but the Shanghaiese speak a language in Shanghai that nobody in China, it would be the difference between US and English and Russian. So people cannot understand, which is always interesting in meetings, because the Shanghaiese will start speaking Shanghaiese during a meeting, and even my Mandarin interpreter can't keep up with that. So there really is multiple economies. When Governor Milliken went in the early 80s and signed a provincial relationship, a sister province relationship with Sichuan, China was a backwater, and Sichuan was way upstream. And today, that area is probably one of the hottest parts of China economically. So to think of China as, one nation that is really doing one thing is really to misunderstand what transpires in that country.
I find in my own experience, the difference was highlighted to me. I was in a conference room with a businessman from Beijing and one from Shanghai. The one from Shanghai accused the fellow from Beijing of being a hopeless bureaucrat, and the Beijing fellow said, "Well, you're an unethical, person involved in commerce," and this was sort of the tone of the conversation. But the one thing they agreed on, that everyone from the south in Guangzhou was a crook. So this is, they all spoke.
Your enemy of your friend's your enemy, right?
That's right. Let's talk a little bit about China vis-a-vis the U.S. directly. China bashing is a great political sport, particularly around election time. What are your thoughts on the constant barrage of China bashing, either from the White House or from Congress or from business people that are making some noise about it?
It's equal opportunity. I mean, it's Democrats and Republican, depending on who's in office. And it's really been fascinating because, one of my earlier career, I was the deputy campaign manager for Jim Blanchard, the governor of the state, and worked for him for a number of years, came back as state superintendent under Governor Engler and Governor Granholm. But when Governor Granholm was running, to give you an example, was running against Dick DeVos. Now, Dick DeVos, the heir of the Amway Corporation, about 11, if I recall correctly, 11 of their $14 billion profit comes out of China. Now, you would think he would have been ready for this, but when he ran against the governor, Governor Granholm, she had a nice bumper sticker saying, "He's going to ship your jobs to China." And Dick DeVos was talking about global economic theory to the groups. Well, let me tell you, I've been involved in politics. Saying shipped out to China versus trying to explain global economics is a dead loser. And it proved to be. But as I walk through, and I think, because I worked with Governor Milliken, I was elected in Detroit, Wayne County to reform the county, bring about a county-elected form of government in the 80s, and so I worked very closely with Governor Milliken and his staff, obviously very closely with Blanchard, Engler, and Granholm, and even Snyder, appointed to the Michigan-China Innovation Center by Governor Snyder. You've had Governor Milliken, who really should get more credit for opening the door, because at that time there was almost no reason to engage with China, early 80s. What are they going to do? It was more what we're going to do for them versus for us. Governor Engler came in, did some things kind of peripherally. Same Blanchard went. In fact, there's somewhere flying around here in Michigan are some Sichuan pheasants that are here, which we got as a gift, so there's some benefit from that. Engler did a little bit of work there. And then under Governor Granholm, she really avoided China. 8 years as governor and never once developed what they refer to in China as Guan Qi. And it's developing the relationships. Dealing with China cannot be the economic or cultural experience as a one-night stand. You have to engage and be involved and work with people if you expect to do that. So I was really pleased when Governor Snyder came in and really picked up that mantle. And Governor Snyder, as a former business person, understood that if you wanted to take, and we spoke about this, if you wanted to go off and argue about the problems in China, whether it's currency manipulation or theft of intellectual property or human rights, you can do that. And there's a constituency and important, but your job as a governor is developing opportunities for the people of Michigan. And so the governor really formulated, I think, two brilliant strategies. One, attracting foreign direct investment into Michigan. and two, exporting our goods and services to China. You know, it's not just 1.4 billion communists, it's 1.4 billion consumers. And as they began to develop and go on from being a very poor country to being a consumer country, you don't need 50% of the market. 1% of the market will do you just fine if you can do it. And if we can sell our cherries or our milk or our educational system to China, that it can benefit. And we saw billions of dollars of investment during Governor Snyder's, generating thousands of jobs. Some of you may notice on I-75, used to be the old, I think, Delphi plant and Saginaw Gear and Steering. It's now called Next Year Automotive. And a lot of people don't realize it, but there's a number of companies like Springfield Ham, that's owned by the Chinese, AMC Theaters, owned by the Chinese. And let me assure you that the thousands of jobs at Next Year Automotive, UAW, high-paying jobs, they don't particularly care who the owner of the company is. It's saved jobs, and a lot of that has to do with Governor Snyder's leadership. I would say that he did more to develop that relationship than all his predecessors before him. And Michigan has a long-standing relationship with China. President Angel, president of the U of M back in the 1840s, was a liaison, kind of a quasi-ambassador to China. So there's been interaction between the state of Michigan and China going back for quite some time.
Well, let's hope that our new governor is able to continue that focus. I think that's a...
Well, I can tell you, I've advised her on this, and so I expect and hope that she will continue to pick up the mantle. It may not, sometimes the politics between the Republicans and Democrats are a little different in terms of constituents they have, but you can't argue the facts. And the fact is by connecting with China, it generated jobs and revenue for the state of Michigan. So it became a win-win. And so I fully expect, even though she'll get more pushback as a Democrat than perhaps a Republican governor, I expect that she'll continue to do it. And as we've talked about it, the Chinese are sitting around with a lot of cash. They got trillions of dollars that have transferred over there. And they're looking for places to invest. And as I would say, my barber cut my hair and, you know, kind of red, white, and blue all the way, our team and everything else, and he would argue with me. I try not to talk about it because I just wanted to get a haircut in peace. But, you know, he would raise it, and I said to him, I said, Jack, is it better to have, in my little community, that Ford dealership sitting empty, the factories in Wixom and Dearborn sitting empty, or is it better to have Chinese, Japanese, Dutch, German investing in putting our people to work, paying taxes? And he kind of got it for that haircut, didn't give me a bad haircut that time, but we were bad at it, you know, the following week, because it's kind of in their DNA to be, you know, anti-China, anti-communist and the like.
Let's follow up on the thought of jobs and the loss of jobs and the common meme running around in our conversations nationally of the fraying at the edges of the American dream and the loss of jobs, generally, the loss of jobs, often laid at the feet of China, if not Mexico. What are your thoughts? What are your thoughts on that? I mean, should we be blaming China for this phenomenon, or
you know, if you look at our history, it takes a lot of reflection to blame yourself for a problem that you're having, to say that you didn't get the education in order to be successful and the like. And then you have, as we talked earlier, politicians on both sides of the aisle that stoke the fear. The facts are we have lost more jobs to automation than we have to China or Mexico. Just facts that's happened. I worked at the Rouge plant, and you may remember the Dearborn Rouge plant. At one time, it was the largest industrial complex. I worked Mondays and Fridays because the guys would get their paycheck on Thursday night, didn't show up, so they hired a lot of college students to work during that time. And you know, at one time, there was 100,000 employees that they literally would bring the steel in from the iron ore coming through Minnesota and the peninsula down and have a train taking a brand new shiny Mustang or F-150 pickup off. Today, and some of it certainly has been with offshoring and globalization, but today, the jobs that I had, and one of the jobs that I'm glad they automated it, because my job was to take a door off of a northbound conveyor, swing it around and carry it about 10 feet and put it on a southbound chassis. Now, I was a stud, right? I could do that all night long. But after about 5 hours of doing that and working 12-hour shift, my arms felt like they were going to fall out of the socket. If you go back, and if you go to Henry Ford Museum, they have a tour of the Rouge Plan, you'll see that it's 60-year-old guy, robot, 60-year-old guy. And I asked the person to give me the tour, the job that the man or woman that are doing they seem like they'd be just as easy to automate. And they said they will be as soon as the contract changes or the person's retire. People have the guarantee of the job. So we're just seeing a tremendous amount of change. But it's a lot easier. If you think back in our history, we blame Jewish people, Italians, Irish, and the like, and there's a lot of fear that's been stoked. Clearly, we lost jobs manufacturing. The other fact is today, China is losing more manufacturing jobs. So somehow or another,
That's right.
People getting convinced that they're going to come back to America. They're leaving China. They're leaving China. They're going to Cambodia and Vietnam and other, because capital goes where it can be most productive, make the most money, where it's welcome, and where it's nurtured. And so China is losing. And the other thing that's happening is any developing country started off, the wages were pretty low, but a very much better making $3 an hour versus maybe a quarter a day, toil in the fields and planting rice paddies all day with your back from sun up to sundown. But it's changing there as well. And China has one of the major challenges that it has is that they say that China must grow rich before it grows old, and it's not going to make it. We had a problem in this country when Social Security was formed, and if I remember the numbers at the time, there was like 8 workers for every 2 retirees, and today it's 2 workers for every 8 retirees, and they're having that same problem. And anecdotal, but as I travel, particularly in the big cities, I look at the person, they look Asian, maybe Oriental, but I ask them, is it not quite sure? Filipino, Malaysia, they're importing workers because they have a labor shortage in China. So nothing is stagnant. The world continues to turn. And so should we worry about it? Yeah, we should be worried, because you should worry and prepare if you're going to compete against a curling club next week. You want to be in the best shape, know what you're doing, your equipment's ready. We should do that. But it shouldn't be all defense. Is what I was talking about earlier. What is our offensive plan? So rather than talking about subtraction and division, which oftentimes the debate is about when we talk about China, we should be talking about addition and multiplication. How do we add jobs here? How do we make sure that if China is going to invest somewhere in the world, that it happens right here in the great state of Michigan, in the United States of America? When we do that and we prepare and make sure that we're ready, there's nobody that can compete with us, in my view.
Let's keep on that Michigan note for a second. Once China joined the WTO, their economy just lit up the sky. In terms of GDP growth rates, in excess of 10% per year, which is unheard of in the history of the world. And they sustained this for year on year on year, and now it's falling back a little bit. But even today, with the growth rate, and the Chinese bemoan the growth rate of 5 and 6%, for us, that would be nirvana.
Yeah, exactly.
It would be the best market of all time. But they're obviously struggling with the structural consequences of a shrinking growth rate. not a shrinking economy, shrinking growth rate. But let's go back to the Michigan connection. You write in your a couple spots, riding the China wave, and riding the China wave from a Michigan point of view. Our succession of governors have had different levels of interest in pursuing that relationship between Michigan and either provincial or national governing bodies in China. So going back to Milliken and Blanchard and Engler and all the way through to Gretchen Whitmer at present, how have we sort of progressed through that succession of Michigan leadership?
Well, when I talk about riding the wave, is that, we need to reflect back. I mean, China with a 5,000-year history, this isn't their first rodeo. 18 of the previous 20th centuries, China had the world's largest economy. And again, it shouldn't surprise folks when you have that many people and isolated and the like. But it's really just the last couple hundred years that China has slid back. And as I indicated earlier, I mean, imagine if a Deng Xiaoping would have taken over, if Mao would have died. As they say in China, Mao was 70% right and 30% wrong. Now, there's also authors that write that nearly 70 million people perished under Mao's reign. Well, that's pretty good if you can be considered 70% right and 30% wrong, and 70 million people of yours died through starvation or policies that you put into place. So, riding the wave is we can do nothing and get swamped, or learn to surf and ride the wave. And so when I was frustrated during the Granholm years, because as I used to say, she played Peking duck with China, really didn't engage and involve. And I thought we had more opportunities that other states and other countries were taking advantage of, because at that time, the Chinese were looking for investments, looking for places to put the money that we had sent them, buying all that stuff we put under our Christmas tree or buy for Easter, or all the things that you don't really need, but we accumulate quite a few of them. And so it really didn't engage. And as I pointed out before, Governor Snyder came in and did more than all his predecessors in the past. So engaging with China, understanding the ups and downs and the problems and the like, just makes sense to me. If not, you're going to stay there, because whether you do it, somebody is going to take advantage. And as I said before, is it better to have a factory sitting empty, or to have it owned by the Chinese that are in turn, they're not going to send Chinese workers here to man the plant, they're going to hire local people. And then those people are going to need to buy donuts and get their clothes cleaned and barber and their haircut and all the other services that go. I mean, people will say for every $2 invested in a community, it generates another $8 of economic activity. So bringing investment in, riding that wave, to me, just makes good economic sense if you want to see your community grow and prosper. And they're sitting on a lot of cash. Let's give them an opportunity to invest it.
It's remarkable that the two largest economies in the world seem to be at loggerheads, and recent diplomacy has been reasonably tortuous and unhappy. At the same time, we've got China has overtaken the United States as the largest trading nation in the world. But what all that tells me is that our domestic economy is much, much stronger.
We buy stuff.
But in relative to these two countries, the Harvard political scientist Graham Allison has recently wrote very powerfully about what's become to be known as Thucydides' trap. And it is the conflict between an embedded power and a rising power. And he uses the Peloponnesian War with the embedded Spartan power over Greece and the rising power of Athens, resulting in war. He cites historically other events, the 30 Years' Wars, the Spanish Succession, the First World War, as examples of the Thucydides trap, where we've got one major power being challenged by another rising power. And he is looking at China and the United States through that particular lens. So, how do we avoid Thucydides' trap? And in fact, are we headed towards a military conflict, or are there ways around it?
I really hope there are ways around it. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. I would say that those are people that want China to fail. It'd be like somebody drilling a hole in the front of the boat, thinking it's only going to impact them. We're all in this boat together. It's a global economy. Our economies are as inextricably linked as a bowl of spaghetti. I mean, it's tied together. So there are a lot of theorists that talk about the trap, the rising power, and the existing power. But there's also been cases in history where we've avoided that. I talk a lot about at the subnational level, local superintendents, presidents of colleges, superintendents of state school systems, universities. At the subnational level, we should be finding ways to engage with China and other countries, to take a broader view of the world, to take our blinders off. At the national level, though, and this is an area which is difficult for me some ways to do, but it was really interesting in how President Trump has come. Now, I don't think he's got any grand strategy necessarily, but I think challenging China has really put them back on their heels. Xi Jinping, the president of China, was boosting a few years ago of China 2025, where they were going to take over, whether it's in biotech or automation or high-end manufacturing or artificial intelligence, and I think we should talk a little bit about that, thought that they were just going to move over. And President Trump, being the uncharacteristic the kind of leader that he is, has really, I think, put them back. And so my hope is the calmer heads will prevail. I fully expect over the next 30 days, which we will find a solution to the trade war. I hope that it's not simply transactional. And by that, I mean that China doesn't just agree to buy a couple $1 billion worth of soybeans, open up their markets a little bit, but not deal with some of the structural issues like theft of intellectual property, forced transfer of technology, and some of the other broader issues. If we do just the transactional, we'll be back at it again. There's a distrust between our countries, and that can be healthy as long as we have open communication. And that's why at the subnational level, while our leaders at the national level may be going at it over those big international issues, at the subnational level, we have to find ways to make it work. Because at the end of the day, that's our future. Because what happens in China, it's not like Las Vegas, folks. What happens in China doesn't stay in China. It impacts the entire world.
Sure.
It impacts the United States. But I'd also argue what happens in China, in between the US and China, is going to impact all of humanity. So it's not just a matter of who's stronger than who. It really is going to be how this world is going to be governed, the relationship between our two countries. And being at war kind of reminds me of that African proverb that when elephants fight, or in this case, when eagles and dragons fight, all the grass gets trampled. And so if we go and find ourselves in a cold war or a hot war, it's not going to bode well for the United States. It's not going to bode well for China, and for that matter, the rest of the world.
Well, let's hope that
Tom
complements
and
indeed.
Jeb, that sounds like a great point to offer an opportunity to our audience to get involved in this conversation. So let me say that the microphones are available, and if you have a question, please raise your hand nice and high so we can see it, and give us your first name, stand if you can, and hold the microphone really close to your mouth.
Right, this gentleman here.
Yes, you mentioned intellectual property. Is that going to be a subject that you'd like to touch on? And if so, I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, the issue that is going on in China today in relationship to intellectual property is that when people would come, there's two different ways they would acquire it. One is the good old-fashioned way, they'd steal it and find a way to tap into computers, pull that information down. But the other one is we've given away our intellectual property, and part of it is the cost of doing business in China. And on this one, I think we have ourselves and a little bit of greed that has caused that. And that would be that if you want to do business with China, you have to have a China partner, and you have to agree to share your intellectual property with them. So if it's designing of a car, computers, or water filtration systems, the like, part of the deal. And the trade-off is for American and other companies across the world is that the China market is just so tempting. It's so large that you're willing to sell your soul or part of your company and part of your future growth. In some ways, we could say it's eating your seed corn when you turn over your intellectual property. So on one hand, they're finding ways to snatch it and take it. Two, we are giving it to them. And the third way that they're acquiring technology and intellectual property is buying it. They are very shrewd, and if they see an emerging technology coming up, and if you can imagine, you've developed something, the great place for innovation in America is your basement and the garage. A lot of great ideas start there, and they germinate out. But you come up with a new technology, and you think your valuation of that company or your investment thus far is $1 million, and the Chinese come in and offer you $25 million. A lot of people sell out at $25 million when they think that they could only get $1 million. So there has been a lot of that, and that's why I say my hope is in the trade negotiations that it's not just transactional, it's not just, open their markets a little more, sell more soybeans or cars, opening up their financial markets to the United States, but it really will be dealing with some of these long-term issues. And some of the things that I'm reading about and talking with people is that some of the sticking points between the negotiators on our two sides are the old concept of trust, but verify, and making sure that, that we don't have an agreement, sign a nice memorandum of understanding, pop the champagne, and then they just don't follow up on it. And so that's really where I think that we're at as it relates to technology.
Right here.
Casey Cowell. So there's with the current regime, there's been a sort of an emphasis or a direction towards autocratic leadership, leader for life, which is a shift from, kind of what was the anticipated direction. And at the same time, where the world has opened up to a little bit based on the development of Western and the deployment of Western technology, to be like the West, at least have economic freedom, has kind of overtaken a big chunk of the world. But in China, at the same time, it's become more autocratic. While the economy is booming, and when you're smaller, it's easier to grow at 7 to 10% a year. They all slow down at some point. At the same time, you don't have Google, you don't have Facebook, you have a nationalized internet service that sees every transaction that happens by everybody. So the question is, in the long term, you know, do you think the black market will overtake it and that'll open up? The economic forces will rage to the fore because they'll let people get wealthy individually, but only to a point is what typically happens with autocratic governments like that. Or do you think, is there an issue there, or it's all going to work out?
Well, I think that you made a lot of good points. Is that the one, Casey, that you pointed out is that about a year ago, 18 months, I think, when Xi Jinping decided to change the Constitution and make himself president for life, and creating that. And there clearly has been a greater tightening down of autocratic rule. You see it on posters and banners that are beginning to pop up, which remind me of my early days in China. A lot of very, very heavy state propaganda that's popping up. The one thing that I see about the Chinese is very adaptable. And there's kind of a trade-off in China, if you look back in the history, is that the citizens will accept a certain level of corruption and autocratic rule and control of their lives as long as their lives are getting better. And over the last 40 years, clearly, you can argue a lot of different issues, and there's all kinds of problems from environmental. And it's one of the things that I say when I'm sitting down eating any seafood. I begin to think to myself, even though I'm enjoying it immensely, that I haven't seen a body of water yet that I wanted to eat out of. So some of the environmental degradation of the country is there. But a lot of people have, I think, a misnomer about China just being copycats. China is moving very much on innovation and investing in technology. And I'll touch on 2 points. The top 20 of the top 20 technology firms in the world, half of them are founded by Chinese. When you say they don't have Google, they have Baidu, you know, pretty much a copycat of it. Alibaba is very powerful. Have any of you heard, raise your hand, if you've heard of WeChat? You know, the few hands are going up, but there are literally places in China that money is no good. You transfer money from your WeChat account to pay for goods and services. Delivery service in China, free. You can order almost anything, and I mean almost anything, and have it delivered the next day from across the country. And yet, it goes back to the other, I think, theme and the point of your question is through WeChat. And they went from not having it, I think I was 3 years in between trips the last couple of years because of new responsibilities I had. I hadn't been to China. I went back, and I literally tried to use cash to pay for something, and they looked at me like I had 3 heads. You know, where's WeChat? WeChat, what are they talking about? I had no idea. You can even, if there's somebody playing a violin on the corner or begging for money, which you don't see too much of, you can WeChat them money. You don't have to throw a quarter in the cup. I mean, it's that technologically rich in the country. The other piece that they have, and it gets to the point that I was talking about on artificial intelligence, because remember the movie The Graduate? When they said, buy plastics? I'd say, you know, look at AI and China is 2 areas to be concerned about and looking towards for opportunity. Because what AI is basically big data, having big data sets, and have the technology to transfer that. Well, imagine just about every single person in China is on WeChat. All that data is being transferred. And can it be used for good purposes? Absolutely. Everybody uses it. You can translate on WeChat, English to Chinese, Chinese to English, find locations, transfer money, and the like. But there's also talk about using that data to create what they refer to as social responsibility scores. You know, we have credit scores. If your credit score is low, you pay higher interest or can't get a loan or the like. But in China, and they've begun to even discuss and implement it, that if you don't have the right social responsibility score, you can't get a plane ticket or a bus ticket or a train ticket. You can't check into certain hotels. And so it can be used to really open up your life or to totally control them. And I see both transpiring today.
I'm a retired teacher, and I'm a little dismayed at the current situation here in the state of Michigan. We just had a poll taken of educators, and 75% of the public school teachers in this state said that they would not do this again. I'm retired, and I've been out for 20 years. I agree with everything that you say. We have to engage. We have to teach our children to want to be able to travel and to have the Chinese and come back here. There was a plan last year, I read, that we were going to have 50 Chinese students come to TCAPS. That has not happened. I was at Michigan State for a conference, and someone showed me, oh, look at that building. That was built by the Chinese, and that's going to be for Chinese exchange students. I don't know what has happened to that, but my point is, I do not see that verve that, you know, of people saying, yes, we want our kids to travel over there. We want to engage. We want them to come here to Traverse City, which is certainly not a diverse situation. How are we going to change that when we have someone who just keeps saying, make America great again, we're the greatest that ever was? No, we have a great deal to do now to rise to the occasion, and I don't see how we are going to do it.
Well, first, thank you for teaching. You make a difference in lives. As I say, and this is me putting on my former state superintendent hat, our great schools, our public schools in this country, are the true Statue of Liberty of this great country of ours. There's not another institution in America today that truly takes the tired, the hungry, the poor, the huddled masses, children to speak English as a second language, children with disability, and give them hope and opportunity. And if you believe, as I do, that our schools are the true Statue of Liberty, then you would have to agree with me that our teachers are the torch lighting the way for us all. Education is a life changer. If it wasn't for that fourth grade teacher that sparked my interest, I wouldn't be sitting on the stage today in beautiful Traverse City talking about China with you. It goes back, though, to the investment. I mean, one is, ideology is one thing, facts are another. We're losing students. Demographics are not our friend in this state. If I recall correctly, and I haven't looked at them in a while, but when I was state superintendent, 2001, 2005, we had 1.7 million K-12 students. I believe that down to 1.5. So 200,000 students have left, not being born. There's not a lot of families like my mom and dad that have 7 children anymore. And so that is coming through the pipeline. And one of the great things about demographics, as you can tell, if there's 100 kids born in 1950, there's probably going to be 100 kids in 1970. You may lose a few moving and the like, but that's a reality. The same thing is happening with our institutions of higher learning. It used to be that if you wanted a higher education, you had to get admitted to a school. There were more slots or more people that wanted to get in than there were slots available, tremendous level of competition. But because of some of the reasons I just shared on demographics, schools are sitting with a lot more vacant seats. The other, in which we talked about, is technology. When I went through school, there was no such thing as the internet, and there's no such thing as e-learning. The fact is that you don't need to come to Northern Michigan University or Northern Michigan College or U of M and the like to get a higher education degree. You can get a degree online from a university across the world and never have to pay dorm fees or the like. Are you losing something from that? Yes. So some of the realities are going to change the way that we do business, and we can't stick our head in the sand. And I expect that one of the big policy debates is going to be in Lansing, is I know a lot of our public institutions, our public universities, in order to attract students, are offering Typically, they'd have to pay international tuition rates, so a Chinese student at Michigan State may be paying 3 times the tuition your son or daughter may pay. Out of state, maybe twice as much. But a number of universities, I know this to be a fact, are offering in-state tuition for out-of-state and out-of-country students. And I think when taxpayers begin to realize that somebody from Indiana can attend Western Michigan or Ferris State at the same tuition you as a taxpayer there's going to be a bit of a pushback. So we need to look at ways where we can fill those seats with people that are willing to pay. And I think that that makes sense both on a economic as well as an educational ability. But it can't be swamping the field. I mean, if you brought in way too many kids into a local community, I think you're going to get pushback, and that's not going to be good for the Chinese students or the U.S. students or the community at large. So you have to do things in a thoughtful, sensible way. But again, thank you for your service as a teacher.
Hi, Tom. My name's Tom. I'm not an educator, but thank you, ma'am, for your education experience. As a non-educator, I'm concerned that I see the current state of the education is pass everybody. Nobody's allowed to fail. As a superintendent, former superintendent of education, would you address that, and how would you fix that?
Oh, my goodness. Above my pay grade at this point. Education, there's not one pathway to success. And I think that we need to find ways to assure that the resources that we are putting in as taxpayers, and the bulk of it is yours and my state tax dollars, are being used in a way that's producing results for us. We have slipped over the last 15 years in education. Michigan, in the past, was one of the more progressive, higher achieving states. Now we're in the bottom. The prior superintendent that passed away about a year ago, they're in the midst of hiring a new superintendent, but the prior superintendent, Brian Winston, set a goal to make Michigan one of the top 10 states in educational achievement, based upon whatever criteria you want. I argue that there ought to be one quality standard. We have too much of the education debate is about, kind of reminds me of the Miller Lite commercial. Tastes great, less filling. Charter schools, traditional schools, e-learning. You can have that ideological debate, but at the end of the day, a lousy school is a lousy school. I don't care whether you call it a traditional public school or a chartered school or a blended or an e-learning or project-based learning and the like. We know that an individual, a family, a community, a state, a nation that invests in education is going to thrive in the 21st century. You can fool some people for a while, but the fact is, if you can't do basic math, you can't complete a complete sentence, you can't write, you're not going to do well in this world. So we're not doing anybody any favors of just passing them along, because it tends to catch up with you. As I talked about China and the investment, when I talked about it before, rather than just blaming China and whining about what they're doing and the like, we need to get serious about investing. And when we invest in our people as a nation, as a community, as a state, we're going to thrive. But when we disinvest, we shouldn't be surprised that we slip behind. I believe that we don't have to worry about China if we worry about ourselves. If we find a way to make sure that a child gets the education they need and deserve. Because we're living in a hyper-competitive, disruptive global economy where ideas and jobs can and do move around the world instantaneously. So if you're not prepared to collaborate, to compete, you're going to fall behind, whether it's an individual, family, state, or nation. So when we invest in our people, we're really investing in ourselves. And when I look, out here, someone says, well, why should I invest? Because I've already paid my taxes, my kids are grown, they're not in the school. It really is investment in our collective future. when we invest in our people, whether it's workforce development or K-12 education or higher education.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Jeff Green and Tom Walker.
Thank you, John.
Okay.